Hello, and welcome to You Are Not the Problem, a podcast on how to move from trauma to possibility.
Together, we will explore the deeper truth. You are not broken. You are not crazy. You are responding exactly as your body was designed to in a world that profits from your disconnection.
This podcast dismantles the myths of the healing industrial complex and dives into the collective unconscious that keeps us stuck in cycles of shame, burnout, and self-blame.
We explore how trauma lives in systems and how rediscovering your intuition, body, and community can become a radical act of resistance.
Because maybe it's not you that needs fixing, maybe it's the world.
This podcast is hosted by three holistic healers.
Hey, I'm Camille, intuitive tarot reader, sex and relationships therapist, and professional witch.
Hello, I'm Doris. I specialize in creating community and recovery for nurses experiencing burnout and the founder of Moonshine Wellness.
Hi, I'm Isabella, a holistic trauma therapist and alternative health practitioner specializing in narcissism, abuse, and domestic violence. So, in today's episode, we are talking about what if you are the problem. But before we get into that, we have a few announcements. So, upcoming in September of 2026, Doris will be hosting a Burnout to Recovery program for nurses. And we also have a few freebies that you can find in the show notes. We have Doris's Get Better Sleep ebook. Camille has a self-love tarot spread, and I have a self-protection meditation. So make sure to check the show notes for more details about that upcoming program and to get any of your freebies. So now into our discussion for today. What if you are the problem? So to start this out, I wanted to share a little bit about some of the work that I have done early in my career around working with perpetrators of domestic violence. So these perpetrators of violence would come into this program, court mandated into treatment. And often what we would find is that people who perpetrated violence would come into this court mandated therapy, and they would often have a story in which they were actually the victims. And there would be all this confusion around, well, who really is the problem here? And the interesting thing about that as well is that on the other side, in my work with survivors of domestic violence, often they would come into therapy believing that they were the problem. And so it kind of brought up this curiosity for us of, when you have this situation where where there's, court mandated and there's real evidence, sometimes even full video recordings of violence being perpetrated, that these perpetrators would believe that they were not the problem. But a lot of times the survivors of violence would believe that they were the problem. And so often also a lot of these perpetrators would come into therapy, and it would take sometimes even 6 months or more for them to even start to recognize maybe there was something that I did wrong here. Maybe I did actually cause harm. And so it kind of prompted us to really deepen into this question of what if you are the problem, and how so many times a lot of us might not even be aware that we might have caused harm.
So we're going to be talking about trauma today and childhood trauma, but also that not everyone that experiences that or levels of it becomes a serial killer. Obviously, this is an extreme example, but I think sometimes in kind of the mainstream media or even some of the recent films that have come out about sort of infamous serial killers, there's a lot of empathy for them because they experienced trauma as a kid. Which again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have empathy for people, but just because someone experienced trauma, that doesn't necessarily kind of wash the slate clean for them to do anything going forward because of that. And some children who've experienced domestic violence in childhood might perpetuate it as adults, but not everyone does. And so we're going to be trying to have this discussion about what is the difference? I know for me, sometimes this discussion comes into are people born evil or good or nature versus nurture. And I know for me, like, I don't believe that people are born evil and that there's kind of like nothing they can do that would change that. I think there's a lot of things in the more nurture conversation, which certainly like childhood trauma would be one of those things that impact people as they grow up and choose to take certain actions later on.
Yeah, I think there's I think it's a mix of both. Definitely not everyone who experiences childhood trauma becomes serial killers, and because otherwise there'd be a lot more serial killers. But I think there's also a tendency to be more of a psychopath and not have empathy for others and feel as if it's okay to perpetuate not just even a little bit of harm, but to take it to that extreme of I feel hurt, so therefore it is okay for me to do this extreme violence on other people. And then there's a range and a degree of that, right? So not everyone becomes serial killers, but then there's so much violence in our society that is okayed and celebrated even. And so there's a spectrum of how much violence is okay, and there's not a lot of self-awareness of people who perpetuate this violence, that maybe that violence isn't acceptable, or I shouldn't be perpetuating violence on other people. And I think it's hard to differentiate between the people who continue to perpetuate violence as adults versus those who choose not to. And like, what is the difference? And I think a lot of it has to do with empathy and being able to have some self-reflection and accountability for your actions and the harm that it causes. And not everyone has that capability or develops that capability as adults. And like you said, Isabella, that there's so many people who perpetuate harm. Their own story in their head is that they are a victim. Like, this other person caused them to have this reaction, so that's the other person's fault. And they don't take any accountability for their own actions and the harm that it causes.
I think you said it so beautifully right at the end there, Doris, about how there's often this story of, oh, this person caused me to engage in violence. And in that belief, there's this kind of narrative that I am not responsible for my own actions. Someone else is responsible for my anger. Someone else is responsible for my engagement with violence. And I think that when we really get down to it, that is a self-protective mechanism, right? That when we hold that belief, it allows us to escape that accountability. It allows us to really hold on to this narrative of being the victim. And also, often that is exactly what happens when, in abusive relationships, there's that element of the blaming the victim, blaming the true victim in the situation, right? Where the narrative being, I hit you because you did XYZ. And that is actually what keeps people stuck in abusive relationships, because so many people and so much of our society has deeply internalized this belief that someone else can cause someone to be violent, versus we are all responsible for our own behavior, and engaging in violence is never an acceptable response.
Well, and our society, like you said, plays into that. When you were just saying that, it also made me think of how we blame people in poverty for being in poverty, right? And that is our society narrative of, you blame the victim. You blame the person who got raped. Like, what were they drinking? What were they wearing? Like, what did they do or didn't do? And we've talked about that before. And so there's this upholding of the perpetuator of violence as the innocent person, and then there's the perpetuation of blaming the victim. And so in our larger society and culture, we uphold those beliefs, and then those are all internalized in the individual as well. So the person who is on the receiving end of the violence internalizes that because it's probably how they internalize something as a child, that they don't deserve better, they deserve this, or it's the pattern that is familiar with for them. And then the person who is perpetuating the violence has been told their story that they've internalized is that they are the victim, even though they were perpetuating the harm.
Yeah. Well,
And
and
so,
yeah, I was just going to say like that when we're talking about the internal messaging, I think I know when I have like therapy clients and we talk about like where that self-talk comes from, it's like, yeah, usually actually it's not, maybe it became internal, but often it was like literally said to you by someone as a child, or again, like kind of in the domestic like violence example you were giving, Isabella, of like, yeah, it's not that people just think that, oh, this person hit me, therefore, like, oh, I should just do better, work better, whatever it is. Usually they have heard that message repeated over and over by that person. And then we really internalize it, like you're saying, almost as a like your way to cope or to try to rationalize or to try to kind of like make ourselves understand like why would this happen, because it does, it's kind of, I think like it's trying to help the person to have like to feel like they have control over a level of it, of like, oh, if I just don't, whatever, if I just have dinner ready at 6 p.m. when they get home from work, like then they won't do this, they won't be upset, they won't do this or that. And it's like sometimes that's true, but yeah, I guess, yeah, to the point of saying that, like, I just wanted to reiterate that I think often the internal dialogue did come from like a real place, either a person or, like you're saying in the poverty example, from like society at large, politicians, news anchors, people on TV that are saying these things that you've heard before, and they get repeated by members of your family, by people around you, that it can be hard to not internalize that as, again, yeah, like your own problem that you should just try to solve.
Right. Well, and I think, like you're saying, most of that is the seed of that is planted in childhood, right? And that the vast majority of violence towards children is perpetrated by someone within the family, often a parent. And so, there's this kind of cognitive dissonance that happens within the child where they kind of see that parent, they see this person who, is supposed to love them, is supposed to care for them, but they're also their greatest source of fear and violence. And so there's this inner struggle within the child of like, how do I reconcile with this? And where on one hand, this person is really hurting me and I'm scared of them. But on the other hand, they're supposed to love me, right? They're supposed to care for me. And if this person doesn't love me, if this person doesn't care for me, what does that mean about me as a person, right? What's my value? And right, then children internalize that and they believe that they deserve that abuse, that they deserved that mistreatment, or that there was something that they could have done to change it or to prevent it. And right, that I think the healing in that in adulthood comes in the recognition of, no, you were a child and that wasn't your fault. You never deserved to be treated in that way. And what really is love, right? That love is not abuse. Love is not violence. And there can be a deep grieving around that of, wow, did I ever truly have that experience of unconditional love that we believe is what we should experience as children from a parent? And when you don't receive that, that leads to this cycle through adulthood of, believing you're not worthy of love or mistaking abuse for love.
yeah, that makes me think of when we talked about love bombing and the narcissist, and how they weaponize those feelings against others because they come on so strong. And if you are susceptible to that because you did not experience love, like true love as a kid, like love without strings attached and love without abuse, then you jump on that because that brings out such endorphins of, I feel so loved. But really, it's the way that perpetuators of abuse get people hooked into a relationship with them, and then you're committed. So then it feels harder to walk away from that. And it might be the only way that you have felt love. And so then you keep trying to make this person love you by doing these extra things because then they won't abuse you. And it is so hard to recognize in the moment too. A lot of times I feel it's easier to recognize things sometimes when you have some space. And I see this actually on Reddit a lot with the "Am I the asshole?" posting, where people will, like, they're just wondering. And a lot of times it is women in these heterosexual relationships who will post, like, my partner's mad at me. They post the whole, like, what happened. And so many times women in the comments are like, that's abuse. Like, you are in an abusive situation and you need to run. But you're in it and they don't recognize it. And I, and it's hard because abusers will isolate other people, so you don't have that outside perspective. And so, yeah, it's just, I think it's hard, and it's really hard to notice it in the moment.
I think, yeah, like with the example of Reddit, right? Reddit is a community forum where you can choose to be anonymous, where it's like they maybe don't have people in their life, or everyone's kind of like, yeah, no, it's fine. They don't see what's going on behind closed doors. It's almost like you can tell something's wrong, but you're trying to figure out, like, is it something I'm doing? Is it something they're doing? And like they're going to a literal like community forum to be like, I need another perspective. And like you're saying, that unfortunately a lot of the times those people, like, people are coming back and saying like, no, that's abuse, like that we're checking all the boxes here, and actually you're not doing anything wrong. But I think this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Isabella, that often victims have been told that they are the problem if they just do something differently. Can you talk about what Darvo is and like how some of that like comes up with perpetrators?
Yeah, absolutely. So DARVO is an acronym that stands for Deny Accountability and Reverse the Victim and Offender Roles. And this is a common manipulation tactic that is used by abusive individuals or narcissistic individuals to, essentially shift the blame, shift the responsibility onto the victim and portray themselves as the victim. And it creates this mental fog and confusion where, on one hand, you have someone who is genuinely being victimized. And on the other hand, you have someone who's playing the victim role. And it can be very confusing to sort through that, right? How do we differentiate between the person who is genuinely being a victim and the person who is playing the victim? And, a lot of whenever I'm looking at situations like that, often what I really go back to is, who has power in the situation, or who is attempting to exert some form of power and control over the other person. And then we can start to really see, what is actually happening there? Is it someone who's just using the situation in order to portray themselves as a victim, in order to manipulate? Or is it, someone genuinely being heard and trying to, voice that? And it can be, I think that's why for so many people who experience abuse, it can be such a confusing experience. And it can be so hard often as an outsider to really even understand what's going on, because oftentimes you will have both people showing up and saying, I'm the victim. And how do you differentiate? How do you really sort through that? And sometimes it is very challenging to do because we're not in the room with people.
Sometimes those relationships get so messy. I imagine, especially in a court of law, it can be hard to differentiate that power imbalance and who really is the victim versus who is playing the victim role. It's not as if people who are perpetuating violence have not experienced violence themselves or trauma in some way. But kind of going back to even the original thought was like, not everyone becomes a serial killer who experiences trauma. And in our culture, I don't think you can live and exist in our modern culture without having experienced some form of trauma. We perpetuate trauma at all levels, like in the home, in the schools, in like the larger culture. There's a lot of perpetuation of trauma, but there's something where some people are able to navigate that in a different way so they don't become perpetuators of more trauma and violence. And I think a lot of it is having some emotional intelligence to be able to look at your own actions and take accountability for your own actions. And even if you're in the wrong, to be able to take accountability for when you're in the wrong. There's such inability for a lot of people to acknowledge that they have made a mistake and then correct that action. You know, like I was in a domestic violence situation with a lot of emotional and verbal and psychological trauma. My husband would always say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll change," and then the pattern just continues. So it's a lot of it is also looking at that pattern. Does the pattern actually change, or are there just platitudes of making change, but there is no actual change? And it's not even just being able to recognize that in other people that you're in a relationship with, but how do you recognize it in yourself? So if you're just always apologizing for actions that you take, but then you're never actually changing those actions, you're just perpetuating these cycles and you're just perpetuating harm and you're not actually creating any change.
Well, and I think, like you said, Doris, that it can be very threatening for people to look at themselves and to take that accountability, right? And that makes a lot of sense, right? We want to, our instinct for all of us is to protect ourselves, right? We want to see ourselves as good. I also do hold the belief that within all of us, there is a seed of goodness, but that how is that seed watered? How is that seed nurtured? Even when we are not necessarily nurtured in the ways that we need, there is also that choice point in adulthood. Am I willing to do that deep work of looking within myself and kind of challenging these internalized beliefs or norms of behavior, or am I wanting to continue that cycle? Right? Do I then come into adulthood and say, "Oh well, I was hit as a kid, therefore I'm going to hit my children"? And sometimes I think we often mistake violence as an isolated incident or isolated experience, but that really it is part of a larger cycle. And if we step back and start to see that cycle on a larger scale, we can see the ways in which we may be inadvertently playing a role in that cycle. And it's not that we want to look at that and then, shame ourselves. That doesn't actually help facilitate change, right? That if I'm looking at a way in which I have caused some kind of harm and then I beat myself up over that and I endlessly criticize myself and say that I'm a bad person, but that is what can actually be the roadblock. That shame can be the roadblock to change. We actually want to take accountability. We want to self-reflect, but we want to do it with compassion and kindness towards ourselves and to know that, yes, I have done something wrong. That doesn't make me as a person wrong. And it's okay to look at that. And it reminds me of this quote by Carl Jung, where he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Right? So often I think we are scared of bringing these unconscious patterns or unconscious behaviors or experiences up to the surface, but that that is actually the work. When we really are able to look at ourselves and see, like, is there something happening here? There's something within me that I'm maybe not conscious of. And I'm letting that rule me from within. And that is when it's actually dangerous, when I'm not conscious of that happening. And I think the shifting comes when we are able to look at all of the parts of ourselves, the parts that we are ashamed of, the parts that we maybe label as bad, but that when we really hold this belief that there are no bad parts within ourselves, maybe just parts of ourselves that, you know, sometimes work against us in different ways, or that maybe make decisions that harm ourselves and others. But every part has a function. And if we can try and understand what is that function there, how is this part trying to protect me, or what is it trying to accomplish or do, then we can try and find a way to meet that need in a way that doesn't hurt ourselves or others.
Yeah, when I talk to my clients, who the majority of my clients are nurses, a lot of what I talk about is patterns that we have learned in childhood keep us stuck in adulthood. And for nurses, a lot of that is we tend to be codependent enablers. And so we get attracted to, in our personal relationships with narcissistic tendency people, because that seems to be the golden relationship, with that you have a codependent enabler and a narcissist. And then even at work, like we are the codependent enablers, and then work a lot of times our healthcare system perpetuates a lot of harm, not just on patients, but on the people who work for the system itself. And really, and it's not victim blaming of you are this kind of person and it will always be this way. And I say that as someone who is a recovering codependent enabler, because you can change. And a lot of it is being able to step back and look at these patterns of your personal and your professional relationships, and being able to notice those patterns, and then be like, what role have I had in this? Not because you're taking ownership of what the actions that others have perpetuated, but if you're allowing other people to continue to perpetuate a lot of harm onto you, whether it's even just like emotional neglect, or and you think, oh, I deserve it because my parents were emotionally immature and this is how I was raised, and so this is a familiar pattern to me, and so this is how I keep getting into these relationships with people who neglect me emotionally and they can't meet my emotional needs. Even just being able to step back and say, how can I meet my own emotional needs, so then I don't put that expectation on other people to meet these needs for me? And you're not taking accountability for other people's actions. You're not taking accountability for how your parents raised you, but you are taking accountability for how you are not meeting your own needs. And, it's like the belief that I will meet my soulmate and then I will be complete and whole, right? It's, I am complete and whole. I make myself complete and whole. And then someone else is a complement to my piece, not that they are making myself who I am, right? And so and a lot of that is you're reenacting these situations that you learned in childhood, who your parents learned from their parents and from their culture at large, because it was a very different culture. And that's that intergenerational trauma piece, that it gets passed down through generations and generations of these behavior patterns. And people talk about being a black sheep and being ostracized from their family, and a lot of times those black sheep are the ones that are stopping these intergenerational trauma patterns, because they're like, hey, it's not okay to treat me that way, whether you're my parent or you're my sibling or I'm in an adult relationship with you. And it's very lonely, but also that is a way that we stop these trauma patterns in society at large, right? Like it takes one person and then you show other people how to be differently, and then they're like, oh, I can do that too, right? Like it just creates an awareness, and a lot of it is having some awareness and self-awareness of how the harm is perpetuated on you, or you're perpetuating harm on other people, and taking that accountability and changing that.
And I think that, that cycle of perpetuation is so important for us to recognize. And, something that I find really interesting in this is that a lot of the research shows that most domestic violence is perpetrated by men, and most abuse towards children is perpetrated by women. And so, why is that, right? Like when we kind of zoom out and we look at it, that it's actually more of like a cycle of power, a cycle of trying to exert power over someone who is in the lower position, right? And so it's sort of that story of, where you got the guy who goes to the office and he's yelled at by his boss, and then he comes home and he yells at his wife, and then his wife yells at the kid, and then the kid yells at the dog, right? And then we have this like chain of violence that just feeds into this cycle, that each person is sort of perpetuating violence onto the person who is sort of lower on the totem pole in some ways than them, because there is sort of this like unconscious um, desire or need to get some sense of power over someone else. And when I'm feeling disempowered, my instinct is to try and exert power over someone else. And so when we take a step back from that, we see that cycle, right? We can see how the ways in which people justify their actions. And there's always going to be some kind of justification for violence, but that maybe that's the problem, is like when we're trying to justify these actions, instead of being able to really look at it and do that hard work, right? Not avoid the discomfort, or just trying to, put a silver lining on everything, or kind of engage in this sort of toxic positivity of explaining everything away, but that, actually really looking at like, oh, this was wrong. And what was my role in that? And how can I step out of the cycle? Like, where is my exit ramp where I can be part of that change?
Yeah. Well, and I think we have to acknowledge, like, we've used the word work or hard work. I think, like, it takes work, which is also part of what makes it so hard. It's like a very active process. I think a lot of it takes practice to, like, stop, kind of like you're saying, the certain cycles, or even like your own patterns that you know you fall into, or that were shown to you as a child. Like, it is literal work. And I know, like, a lot of this can be like the responsibility, viewing things, looking at patterns, childhood trauma, that can be facilitated through things like therapy, right? That can be a space where you can do this work. It doesn't have to be that way. But I think we have to acknowledge that it is work. And again, like, I think it's worthy work. Like, I think it's like, I would hope it's a thing that all people are doing, but I think it's part of why it's a lot easier to talk the talk than walk the walk, right? Even like on the more side of, yeah, like the victim, where it can just be very challenging to, because it's like when violence is perpetuated in big systems and culture and government and, like you said, schools and family, it's really hard to like stop any of those patterns as an individual. And we'll get into more of like, what do you do about it? But I just sort of wanted to acknowledge that it does require like active work. And again, I think sometimes, yeah, things like for perpetrators, and part of why um, therapy might be a long-term thing, or accepting responsibility is a long-term thing, is that it requires a lot of, yeah, looking at how you impact other people, looking at, yeah, how you were treated and what you think is normal and okay. And just because that is modeled outside of your home or family in many places, that doesn't mean that it's okay. But I do think that that's part of what makes it so hard to do.
Absolutely. And I think that, what you're really speaking to is how that often growth comes from some amount of discomfort.
Yeah.
And we have to really build that capacity to hold that. And that can take time, right? For us to be even able to get to that point of acknowledging what even happened and looking at, that shame that blocks healing, right? That toxic shame that blocks us from being able to heal from what happened and to really move through the repair process. And I think that's where often people get really stuck is they are often in that defensive position of trying to defend themselves, defend, who they are. And that's where I think it's so important to try and separate that, you know, everyone has that capacity to cause harm. We all have that within us. I don't think anyone can fully escape that. And it's our responsibility to be conscious of that we do have actually a sense of power and a sense of free will, and how we use that, how we use our bodies, our minds, our behavior has an impact on other people. And taking that compassionate accountability of, I am responsible for my response, for my behavior. I'm not responsible for other people. But I have to really look at what is my responsibility here and do that work of, you know, self awareness and looking at how my actions may have impacted myself and other people.
Yeah, and that goes for people who are receiving the domestic violence or trauma, as well as the people who are perpetuating it too. There's work on both ends. And the person who feels that they deserved it or that they had some sort of role in a trauma being perpetuated onto them, like they have their work is to learn how to not feel responsible for someone else's actions. And then the person that is perpetuating the harm, they're responsible for being able to recognize even that they perpetuated harm and having some accountability for that. Everyone has a role to play, but it's so hard because people don't want to acknowledge that they have a role, or they just don't want to have their feelings, right? We are so scared because we have been taught as children, you act out, you get put into your room, right? You're disciplined for having these big feelings as a 2-year-old. And so you learn to not have these big feelings because you learn that those feelings are bad, whether they're good or bad, right? Like no matter whatever feeling it was. And parenting has a big impact on that, how you parent your kids so that they can feel their feelings and they don't become scared to have their feelings. And that creates a huge ripple effect. I say that as a parent. It has a huge ripple effect to your children, how they will be able to handle their feelings into adulthood. Feelings last like 90 seconds, usually, right? And we're so afraid of just sitting in that uncomfortable feeling, whatever that feeling is. And so we do everything that we can to not feel our feelings. And that's where we get stuck in these patterns of either being the perpetual victim in our own story or being that toxic positivity person where it's like, everything's fine. The world's on fire, but it's fine. Like everything's all fine, right? And so it's really being able to look at what the real situation is, being able to sit in your own feelings, whatever they are, and then also then making the change based on those feelings. Like changing your actions so you don't feel as if you're constantly in this victim mode or owning other people's actions, right?
I think that, Doris, you highlighted something important too in the how important our languaging is when we talk about these things, right? That often even just the language of like the victim and the perpetrator, right? It creates this binary of like good and evil, right and wrong. And it is often so much more nuanced and it's not so clearly black and white. And that we can also get really stuck in these labels and these identities. And, something that I often share with clients is that often I think, especially when we have been truly victimized, that it takes even just some time to reckon with that, right? That to even acknowledge, I am a victim in some way, and to really sit with that for a while. But then eventually we have to be able to move beyond that. Like we have to be able to first say, yes, I am a victim. I was victimized. And then we shift into being a survivor, right? I survived that. How did I survive that? And what was it in me that helped me survive through that experience? But then also, we don't want to be stuck in surviving, right? We don't want to be just surviving all the time. We want to even move beyond that role, that label and that role of as a survivor, right? Moving into, I think that, to keep the, whatever the alliteration, I think in the language, people would say, oh, then you become a thriver, right? I don't know if I love that word so much, but I think
I
the
think that
concept,
goes with the toxic positivity.
I see that last stage as, okay, yes, we can put thriver in there, but maybe at the end of all of that, we no longer let these different identities or these roles or these experiences rule our lives and rule our consciousness. We acknowledge, yes, this happened. I was victimized and I survived that. And now I am thriving more in my life. And now maybe I even let go of all of that. And it's not something that I need to cling so tightly onto as my identity. How do I then even move beyond this binary, move beyond these labels? And I think that can be a very hard thing when something is obviously very impactful on you as a person or on your life. And we don't want to minimize that, but we also need to eventually move into that stage of moving beyond trauma. And that can be a hard thing for people to move into. And it takes a long, long time as well.
Yeah. Well, we like to think that it's a linear process, right? It's like, okay, the thing happens. We acknowledge it happens. We take responsibility. We, like you said, we kind of examine the role that we played, that other people play, and then we try to do better in the future. And then I think we all love to think that, like, all right, and then I'm healed. But it's like, no, I think like it is also often a cycle, and that you might get put back into, right, a different system, or you're going to interact with government or school or work where that pattern is going to show up again. But I think still it's like this, I'm thinking of it's like a straight line, and then you loop in a cycle, but then you get to move a little bit forward. And then you kind of like might end up in another cycle again, and then you get to move a little bit forward, where it sometimes I think can feel like two steps forward, one step back, because there is no perfect, there is no healed necessarily in this way, but we can learn from our experiences. We can learn from things that happened before to kind of like try our best to not fall into those type of situations again. But I think that's also part of what is so challenging. You can intellectually know the cycle, what happened before, but there's so many systems that have this sort of violence inherent in them, or punitive aspect, that I would say it's inevitable that you're going to interact with that cycle again. And so I think that's part of also the acknowledgement of it, and the growth and self-awareness helps by saying like, okay, yes, I might be put back into this again, but that's not fully my individual fault. That's this system. And sometimes we have to choose how we interact with systems, or we might choose to interact with a system that feels violent in some way, or that does enact these things. But it's also very hard to think that we're just going to be healed and not have to deal with any of it anymore, because I just don't think that that's realistic. And I think if we teach people that, or even the way that a lot of perpetrator programs work, which are like, you go to court, you get sentenced, you sometimes get therapy for it's mandated therapy for 6 months or an anger management program or a certain type of thing. And then often you kind of like lose support or often even like accountability after that. Where I think in my ideal world, there would be the idea that, actually people need support like forever. And I think too that that's part of, again, if we're getting more into like the healing tools and like how do we interact with these systems, is that it's very hard to do any of it alone, right? I think even with trauma and the recognizing cycles of abuse or violence, even if you just have like one person that's like, I don't know about that, or like, that seems really abusive, like that, just that one person can really help us start to question, like, wait a minute. And I think that's sort of like the upside is that it doesn't necessarily take much to implant the idea that something is wrong, and that there's still a lot of work that comes after that. But I think when we think about changing systems, or like, again, what's our big kind of like takeaway, it's like, yeah, it's really hard to change society to large culture, but it takes individuals in community taking action over time, and support and accountability, again, in groups, in community, to continue onward with that, because it is like an ongoing thing that we have to deal with as people in a society.
Right. And I think that it's, the combination of it being both an individual work and a collective work.
Yeah.
And often I think we label this as an individual problem, that violence is an individual problem. It's about self control, it's about willpower or, you know, discipline or whatever is the sort of the belief around this being an individual problem. But that while, yes, there is a component of individual work, and like you said, it only takes one person to stop that cycle, but also it is also a collective problem. And maybe instead of focusing only on the individual, what if we were to really step back and look at the problem of violence more upstream, right? Really looking at what is, furthering this cycle, like maybe even to take ownership of this society, and how do we really nurture children? How do we support parents, right? How do we really create a system that, sets people up for success and gives people the tools to be able to parent, to care for children, to, also call things out when things are happening and intervene. And, we need more support for people. And that, I think that comes when we take more of this collective understanding about violence and how it's perpetuated, that we really see that this is a collective issue. It's not an individual issue. And it requires all of us to be invested in addressing that and in healing that from a collective standpoint.
Yeah, and even, it's hard because so here in Washington, there was a law passed to do sex education, appropriate sex education for like kindergarten on. And I don't know if that ever got implemented because there was a huge backlash of people who thought that teachers would be teaching like such a sex education to kindergartners like you would a high schooler, right? But the intent of it is to give young children the appropriate names for their body parts, because then if they are harmed, they can tell the police what body part was harmed and what happened in a generalized context, instead of having random names, because as a society, we can't talk about sex either. And so we have these random names for body parts. And it's the same thing of if we were able to teach children that being touched or being hit is not okay. And I think there has been a big shift in that, because I went to kindergarten in like 1981, And uh, the elementary school had just gotten rid of the paddles that they would use to discipline children. And because for my brothers, it was still normal to be hit by the principal if you got in trouble in elementary school. And they had just stopped that when I was entering elementary school. And a lot of that is there has to be some sort of law to create it across the board. Like, these are changes that have to happen. Like, you cannot hit children in school. But then all these subsequent generations, like, it's never been a thing. Like, you've never had to experience that fear, because again, teachers are similar to parents, where like there's a level of trust that the kids have with their parents. And then if your teacher is also the one disciplining you in such a way that you're creating a lot of rupture, and then there's no repair, and then you're perpetuating this cycle of violence as well. And so a lot of it does, I think, come back to how to support your parents, and how to, like, here in the US, we're the only industrialized country that doesn't have parental leave. In Washington State, we now have it, but I think we're one of the few states that actually have paid parental leave.
It's still pretty new. Yeah.
Yeah. But why? Like, why is that not just normal? Because there's so much bonding that needs to happen, not just in the first 6 weeks, because the birthing person is still like recovering in those 6 weeks, and then you're supposed to go off to like work again. But there's so much bonding, and like parents don't feel supported because a lot of us as parents are also isolated, right? We don't have grandma nearby. We don't have that community to support us as parents. It's the two separate parents and then their kids, and then good luck, right? Like, and so then you're running at these high stress levels anyways. And of course that's going to translate into your children, because like you said, that's the power imbalance. That is, like, you're stressed, and so then you're yelling at your children and you're not bonding with them. And then it just like perpetuates that cycle of intergenerational trauma. And here in the US, we have this individualism, like, oh, we can all like pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, which is also fucking bullshit. And it's like, and then that also perpetuates, because then as a culture, we feel that we should all be responsible for our economic self and our emotional self, but then we're not. And if we can start creating a society where we raise children in community instead of by ourselves, and the parents felt supported, not just by like what they earn, but also by what society can help support them with, it will have a huge ripple effect onto how our children feel and act. It won't be immediate generation, but it'll be the generation subsequent that will feel that subtle impact, and it'll be huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think so. I think, what maybe our final takeaway is that we want to offer to listeners today is that, right, not everyone who has childhood trauma becomes a serial killer. And so how do we really work with what happened to you in the past? And that there needs to be a level of choice and accountability as we get older, and really looking at that within ourselves. And that maybe being kind of curious about how this pattern of, often when people think they are the problem, then often they're actually not. But people who think they're not the problem often are. So I think that's something that we'll continue to unpack within this podcast of, how do we reconcile with when are you the problem and when you are not the problem? So if you found this episode interesting, please share this episode with a friend to help them connect to this understanding.
Yeah, and even just open up a conversation about some of these things. You can join us for a new theme every month in our unhinged exploration of trauma, power, and what it really means to heal.
And remember, you are not the problem.
Unless you are.